Good afternoon, students. Today we are going to start with our third story, short story entitled Grief by Anton Chekhov. Grief is the story of a father's grief over his son's unfortunate death, and the grief is within him, and he desperately wants to speak about it to lighten his burdensome misery. But no one is ready to listen to him. Now, in this story, Grief by Anton Chekhov, जो ग्रीफ उसके अंदर है, जिसके बारे में वो बात करना चाहता है, अपनी उस बर्डन सम मिजरी, दिल पर जो उसके भारी बोझ है, हैवी हार्ट. क्यों है उसका हार्ट हैवी? बिकॉज रिसेंटली उसके यंग और बहुत ही प्रॉमिसिंग सन की डेथ हो गई, जो कुछ दिन बीमार रहा और उसकी डेथ हो गई. एंड देयर इज नो वन इन दिस वर्ल्ड to whom he can talk about him. No one is ready to listen to him. So Iona Potapov, a Russian cab driver, बहुत ही sensitive man, and his young son died in a hospital following 3 days of intense illness. Now, when you are bereft of one of your dear ones, you either need someone to say it's all right, after all, we all have to die one day, or we should have someone to go to and cry for a while. दोनों ही कंडीशंस आयोना पोटापोव के लिए पॉसिबल नहीं थी. He was a sledge driver. None came to console him. There was no one in the world to console him. His wife has died long back. Now his only son has left him. And in this selfish world, there's no one around him who can console him, sympathize with him, hear to what he has to say about that. And so the story portrays how a city is deprived of feelings. In this story, Aina Potapov, जो बहुत ही सैड है, डेस्परेट है, अपनी स्लेज पे बैठा हुआ है, बेंड डाउन, उसके ऊपर बहुत सारा स्नो फॉल हो रहा है, स्नो से टोटली वो ढका हुआ है. एंड ही इज लीस्ट बॉदर्ड अबाउट द स्नो. कभी कभी वो बीच में थोड़ा सा अपना शरीर को हिलाकर स्नो को हटाता है, बट वो जो स्नो है वो भी उस पर इफेक्ट नहीं डाल रही है. बिकॉज इन दिस वर्ल्ड वॉट ही वॉन्ट्स टू डू इज ही वॉन्ट टू टॉक अबाउट हिज सन who has recently died. अब उसका जो छोटा सा स्लेज है was pulled by this little mare, white motionless creature, जिसके बारे में जो कैब में चढ़ने वाले लोग कहते हैं हाफ पेनी जिंजर ब्रेड हॉर्स. तो दोनों both are busy with their own thoughts. Both are engrossed in their thoughts. It was already night, and Iona and the mare looking for fares. And there are so many people on the dark road, drunkard and decent-looking men, but Iona had no fear. कोई भी आकर नहीं कहता कि कैबी, are you free? We will take us to something. फिर ultimately Iona gets a fare. An officer in a military overcoat with a hood over his head. He wanted to go to Vyborg-Skaya. Iona studies the officer, makes an attempt to strike a conversation with him, wished if he could tell the officer of his son's death. Officer didn't find the topic very interesting, so Iona stopped speaking about his son's death. And he says, yeah, you all have to die. After taking the officer to his destination, Iona waits for another fare. 3 young men, 2 tall and thin, 1 short and hunchback, come up railing at each other, loudly stamping on the pavement. And thus goes on. So this is all about the fears that get into his cab, and they are least interested in what the driver has to say. They just are shouting at her, grumbling at him, shouting at him, and they just want to reach their destination. They just leave him, and there's no one around him to listen to what he has to say. So, this is the story of a father's grief over his son's unfortunate death. Grief is within him. He desperately wants to talk, but no one is ready to listen to him. So, बेसिकली दिस स्टोरी ग्रीफ जो है, जो कि अपनी मिजरी शेयर करना चाहता है, अपने दुख को बांटना चाहता है, उस दुख के बारे में सबसे कहना चाहता है, बट ही इज़ नॉट गेटिंग अ कंपैशनेट ऑडियंस ही नहीं मिल रही उसे. और उसका जो फाइनल एफर्ट है टू पोर आउट हिज मिजरी बाय टॉकिंग टू हिज मेयर, हिज ओनली कंपेनियन, the only is one and only companion who is ready to listen to him, who is not saying no, I'm not interested, please don't say anything to me. So in this one word, grief, the title accurately summarizes the mood the story carries. यहाँ पर हमें बता रहे हैं कि किस तरह से ये जो संसार है, सेल्फ सेंटर्ड, अनरिस्पॉन्सिव, feelingless nature of human beings in this world. So the title portrays the overwhelming grief of Aina Potapov, the old sledge driver, over the loss of his son and his futile attempts. कई सारे futile कहते हैं बेकार, क्योंकि उसने बहुत बार कोशिश की, अपने जो भी उसके कैब में आके बैठा, जितने भी उसके फेयर्स आए, जिनको भी उसने डेस्टिनेशन पे छोड़ना था, तो he tries to lick his lips on his, he clear his mouth, he licks his lips, sore throat, he wets his lips just to speak about son, and no one is interested. वो जो futile efforts हैं, उसके attempts हैं to share with fellow travelers in his sledge, अपने fellow travelers के साथ में वो अपनी स्टोरी शेयर करना चाहता है, लेकिन सारे जो उसके अटैम्प्ट्स हैं वो फ्यूटाइल हो जाते हैं. डिस्ट्रेस और जॉय, जो भी हम अपनी लाइफ में झेल रहे होते हैं, हमें कोई ना कोई चाहिए जो हमारी बात को सुने. देयर कैन बी नो क्योर फॉर इमोशनल डिस्ट्रेस unless it is let out and shared with others, but Iona has to keep his emotions within. There are no listeners to lend an ear. He has been rendered alone by the death of his son, and his loneliness increases when he finds no one with whom he can share his agony. अपना दुख, अपना दर्द वो किसी के साथ नहीं बांट पा रहा है. इससे उसकी एग्नी, उसका दुख और ज़्यादा मल्टीप्लाई होता जा रहा है, बढ़ता जा रहा है. He is severely alone and therefore is miserable. And in the evening, Chekhov describes realistically the shades of darkness all around, heightened by white snow, movement of people, night lamps have lightened up. In the darkness, nothing is visible, and constant motion of people who are not seen but whose voices are heard. Darkness around him is a measure of the darkness within him. So, Iona, bent double with age and grief, sits white like a ghost. His mare stays still and motionless. तो ये सारी छोटी छोटी बातों के थ्रू चेकॉफ जो है हमें उसकी लोनलीनेस के बारे में बता रहा है, कि लोगों की भीड़ के बीच में वो रोड साइड पे बैठा हुआ है, अब किसी ट्रैवलर का इंतज़ार कर रहा है कि उन्हें कोई फेयर मिल जाए, उन्हें पैसा मिलेगा, फेयर आएगा, कोई उनकी स्लेज में बैठेगा, डेस्टिनेशन पे पहुंचेगा, कुछ अर्न करेगा तो वो उसके लिए फॉर्डर लाएगा, अपने लिए खाने का अरेंजमेंट करेगा, लाइक दैट. So he is surrounded by people and yet remains all alone in his grief. So he experiences a death in life existence. Now what about the passengers that came and sat in his cab? First was an army officer who is in hurry to reach his destination, and he's young, full of life. Ayana is old, lost in his grief. Officer jokes, light-hearted mood. Ayana desperately seeks the officer's attention, but he keeps his eyes shut and his ears closed, disinclined to listen. Chekhov uses the stream of consciousness technique present, the continuous flow of grief in Iona without resorting to graphic description. The best part of the story is this. And second group of passengers on the sledge is bunch of 3 travelers, young, noisy, not very caring about the world. It seems as if they were drunk. One of them is a hunchback. Despite his physical deformity, he feels superior to the old man who's weighed down with grief. They have no sympathy for the old man who tries to tell them of his son's death. The old man is gentle and kind to his mare. He doesn't whip his mare to speed up. In contrast, the Yankees ride roughshod over his feelings. Iona laughs when he sees them. They are merry, they are joyful, they are entertaining, but they have no eyes to discern the old man's sorrow. An officer or a party goer, the attitude to the old man's grief is the same. Neither can empathize with Iona's sadness. कोई भी ऐसा नहीं है जो उसकी गाड़ी में आके बैठता है या उसकी बात सुनता है या उससे सिंपैथाइज करता है या उसकी लोनलीनेस को समझने की कोशिश करता है. Iona's son died quite recently. उसकी जो मिजरी है वो इरेज नहीं हो पाई है अभी तक. बार बार वापस वो उन्हीं मूड में चला जाता है, वो उसी को रिकलेक्ट करता है. हाउ हिज सन डाइड, द हॉस्पिटल, इज फीलिंग tearful, is feeling deadly. He wants his son back desperately. And look of anxiety and suffering, Iona lays stray restlessly among the crowds moving to and fro, both sides of the streets. He cannot find among those thousands someone who will listen to him. His misery is immense, beyond all bounds. उसका हार्ट जो है burst, फटने वाला है. And his misery to flow out. It would flood the whole world, it seems, but yet it's not seen. Has found a hiding place in such an insignificant shell that one should not have found it with a candle by daylight. So, आयोना का जो ग्रीफ है कैन स्वैम्प द होल वर्ल्ड. पूरे संसार को वो स्वैम्प क्या होता है? दलदल. यानी पूरा संसार उस ग्रीफ में दब सकता है, उसमें फंस सकता है. Yet its immensity is not seen. कितना बड़ा दर्द, कितने बड़े दुख से वो गुजर रहा है, कोई ये समझ नहीं पा रहा. No one can even fathom the depth of its intensity. और उसे एक ऐसे आदमी की ज़रूरत है जिसके सामने वो अपना हार्ट पोर कर सके, अपनी फीलिंग्स शेयर कर सके, अपने इमोशंस को बता सके. लेकिन ऐसा एक भी सेंसिटिव पर्सन उसे नहीं मिल रहा. Could give an ear to what he has to say. When his fears were in his sledge, Iona is comforted with the thought that he had company to share his grief with. To that extent, his grief is eased. But when he is back alone in his sledge, watching crowds moving to and fro, he realizes that a crowd is no company. Iona drives a few paces away, bends himself double, gives himself up to his misery. Again and again he attempts to talk to people, but all his attempts prove futile. सारे के सारे attempts they proves futile, and he is alone and still as his mare. He burdens his heart to the passive mare. He asks the mare how she would feel if she had a colt. If you had a foal when he dies, you would be sorry, won't you? The mare does not answer, breathes on his hand, but in that unspoken moment, the animal's tender and unprotesting look comfort the old man. He feels that he had touched a sympathetic chord in his ear, the only possession he had still with him. He pours his heart out to her. So, Iona Potapov, his son Kuzma Ionich, was all he had to share his life with, but he has gone. ये स्टोरी के एंड में एक ही बार उसके सन का नाम आया है. इंडिकेशन है that for the old man, his son was lot more than his name. His grief was connected to the subtleties of his son's memories, and Iona forgets to mention his name. Ending is deliberately left inconclusive, but the story drives home the point that humans are basically insensitive to others' pain and lack any involvement in sharing in the grief of fellow men. स्टोरी की जो क्वालिटी है, it's very simple. That struck me in the story's quality of simplicity. Chekhov has an eye for detail. He is a photographic and cinematographic realist, as though he has a camera that accurately portrays a piece of life. Chekhov once said that art tells the truth. Tolstoy said art tells the truth because it expresses the highest feelings of man. Chekhov's seemingly simple story affirms the truth about human behavior, and as the story focuses on everyday's reality, centers on the psychological aftermath of an event that breaks up everyday routine, leaves the central character helpless. The rhythm of the sledge driver, Iona's life is broken by the news of his son's death. He feels the need to communicate his feelings of loss to his fears. It is the objectification of grief. His grief has been objectified. Its incommunicable nature. ग्रीफ जो है उसने एक ऑब्जेक्ट का फॉर्म ले लिया है. अपनी ग्रीफ को वो कम्युनिकेट नहीं कर पा रहा है. And through the presentation of deliberate details, Chekhov's prose is lucid with a simple vocabulary. The translator has attempted to follow his style. Chekhov uses metaphorical language to recreate the scene. इसीलिए जो स्टोरी का एंड है, द ओल्ड मैन साइज एंड स्क्रैचेस हिज हेड, क्योंकि जब वो अपनी प्लेस पे लौट आता है उसे लगता है कि ओह आई हैव कम सो अर्ली एंड ही सॉ अदर्स कंफर्टेबली स्लीपिंग एंड देन ही सीज अ यंग मैन who gets up, he wants some water to drink. And just as much as the young man wanted to drink, the old man wanted to talk. That is important. Because it will soon be a week since his son died, and he has not been able to speak about it properly to anyone. One must tell it slowly and carefully how his son fell ill, how he suffered, what he said before he died, how he died. One must describe every detail of the funeral, the journey to the hospital to fetch the defunct's clothes. His daughter, Anicia, remained in the village. One must talk about her too. Was it nothing he had to tell? Surely. The listener would gasp and sigh and sympathize with him. It's better, too, to talk to women, although they are stupid. 2 words are enough to make them so. Are you tucking in? Aino asks his horse, looks at his bright eyes. Naturally, sees. He talks about his son to the mare, to his horse only. Yes, I am too old to drive. My son could have what I. He was a first-rate cab driver. If only he had lived. Aino is silent for a moment, then continues. That's how it is, my old horse. There's no more. Kuzma, I'm rich. The little horse munches, listens, and breathes over his master's hand. Aino's feelings are too much for him, and he tells the little horse the whole story. And in this way, he gets relieved of that burden he had. अपने उस बर्डन को उतारने के लिए जब उसे अल्टीमेटली उस पूरी स्टोरी को रिसाइट कर दिया उसने हॉर्स के सामने, और हॉर्स was there, who snuffs, who munches, who listens to him, who breathes over his hand. Sufficient enough to say, oh, I understand. I'm with you. This is all about the story.